Hello everyone, this is Jotto, bringing you the HearthStone Weekly, bringing you the top decks, bringing you the top cards, and the state of the metagame for this week's tournament. Now, before we start, I have a cold. That's why I sound odd. I have a cold, not much I can do about it, the weeklies must go on, etc, etc. So if I sound slightly off, it's because I have a cold. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Now, I'm doing top 4 from now on. I was doing top 4 deck lists anyway, and top 8 just felt tedious, and it felt like an old tradition that just didn't need to be there anymore. So I'm cutting it down to top 4. If you think it should be top 8, then tell me in the comments, and if I get enough people wanting top 8, I'll move it back. But until that happens, I'm going to keep it at top 4. Top 8 just felt tedious. So, top 4 from NA. First place, Eldorian. Second place, Morlu. Third place, Reels. Fourth place, Vex Juked. Onto Eldorian's Warlock aggro deck. Now, this is pretty much a copy-paste from last week's Warlock aggro deck, so if you want the full opinion, go onto that deck. I'm just going to go over it quickly. It's a deck that plays a lot of early drops with buff minions, like Shattered Sun Cleric, Dark Iron Dwarf, Defender, Flame Imp, that kind of stuff. It also plays a mid-game and Argent Commander and Ventrico Mercenary, and plays as few spells as possible. The game plan is essentially overwhelm your opponent by playing a bunch of minions and life tapping. It's an absolute tier 1 deck at the moment. It's been doing very well at tournaments. If you want to do well at tournaments, I would suggest testing against this deck. Now, another deck I would test against is the Paladin aggro deck. This has been doing well for months. Did well in BlizzCon, it's doing well in Mana Grinds tournaments. It's been around for about 3 months now, been doing pretty well. Plays a lot more spells than Warlock aggro. It plays a few burn spells, things like Avenging Wrath, Hammer of Wrath, Consecration. They can use direct damage or removal, that's the important bit. Also plays less minions, so it needs that burn, but it can compensate for less minions and therefore less damage with its weapons. Sword of Justice makes all of its minions much better, and True Silver is just removal against taunt and also very powerful direct damage and sometimes even healing in a race. On to third place, another deck that we've seen recently. Now, this, to be honest, this whole trend thing is expected. It's what happens in card games. Net decking is a big thing in card games and competitive scene. So, while it's interesting to see these decks, what I'm going to be focusing on more as the shows go on is the changes to the standard. So, for this deck, it's a Rogue Cantrip aggro deck. Everyone's seen this deck by now. But this deck plays a sap. Now, sap is sort of the big change with this deck, where it doesn't play Notion Mentor either, but it plays sap. Now, one sap does more than you'd think. One sap effectively allows you to, instead of brute forcing through taunt, you can just sap it and continue. Sap is a very powerful tech against aggro and mid-range, and just tempos your opponent out and lets you get that crucial advantage that you need to win the game. But besides that, Rogue Cantrip aggro is essentially a deck which focuses around maintaining hand by playing cards like Loot Hoarder, Novice Engineer. As I said, sorry, I have a cold, I'm stumbling over my words a bit. But it plays cards like Loot Hoarder, Novice Engineer, Bloodmage Thanos, Azure Drake. These maintain their hand because when they die or when they get played, they replace themselves in your hand. It's a very big deal, especially in aggro mirrors. This is a very good anti-aggro deck because it just trades and trades and trades and gets card advantage. Now on to fourth place. This is another Warlock aggro deck. The one change in this situation is the Mortal Coil, which helps deal with some 1-drops to finish off these higher end minions, and also if your opponent has a Blood Imp, then just trade normally and then Mortal Coil to deal with that 1 extra health. Draw a card. Very interesting card to add into this very sort of generic shell. Now onto the top 4 from EU. We had first place Forsen, second place Judoki or Judokai or whatever. Third place, return of the best name ever, Porn. And fourth place Wushseme. Yes, I know it's sandwich in German, and sorry if I butchered that to all the German viewers. But anyway, on to Forsen. Now, Forsen is notorious for this. He never gives deck lists. He used to be in the Cockatrice community, the simulator we used to play on before the beta came out for HearthStone. And every single time he did one tournament, he didn't show his deck list, and this is no different. So there's not much I can say. He played Priest. That's all I can really say. This is what Forsen does. Not much really to say about it. Anyway, Judoki, Paladin mid-range. Now this is a, weirdly enough, compared to the aggro deck, has less spells, which is funny if you think about it, but it's playing a lot higher curve. Guardian of Kings, Azure Drakes, Tyrion Fordring, Lay on Hands. These are very late game cards that really help power through. Against control decks, you just have this fast opening, and also you can maintain yourself late game to really compete with them. Against aggro decks, you have the same speed coming out the gate, but then later on in the game, you get your Lay on Hands, your Tyrion Fordring, get massive advantage, and just power through. It's a very well-rounded deck. Nice to see Paladin midrange making a comeback between last week and this week. Deck we haven't seen a lot of up until recently. Now, on to third place, Porn played 2 decks. First is Mage midrange. Now, the main question to ask is what makes this different from the aggro variant? The aggro variant is much faster. This deck plays things like Chillwind Yetis, Water Elementals, and things like Flame Strike, Second Pyroblast. Still playing the Blizzard. The aggro variant plays that as well, but it's worthy of note. And a Cone of Cold. This slows down the game a lot, allows the more sort of sturdy minions to come online, and also the 2 Pyroblasts. The 2 Pyroblasts are effectively your win condition against mid-range or control decks. And against aggro decks, it helps in the top deck war because it's just you top deck it and deal them 10. It's a very well-rounded deck. It's nice to see this kind of deck come back as well. We've seen a couple of decks come up recently in the mid-range variant. It's nice to see a mage mid-range deck do well. Now, this is another rogue cantrip aggro deck. This is playing Betrayal on Assassinates as well as some of the other stuff. It's pretty standard, just drawing cards off your minions. The Assassinate helps deal, it's sort of like the sap variant in this particular deck. Only it's slower, but then you fully deal with it as opposed to just sending it back to your opponent's hand for them to replay it. Betrayal also helps with these Blood Imp decks, and it deals with a lot of things. If they play Defender, you just Betrayal what they buffed, and it kills the Defender. Same with Shattered Sun Cleric, Dark Iron Dwarf, things like that. Just deals with all the buffed minions. Betrayal is a very good card in the current metagame. Now, on to 4th place, a rogue midrange deck? What is this? Now, Dorox played a deck like this a while ago. Dorox was a very, very good player back in Cockatrice, but he stopped playing. After a while, he stopped playing, but he was pretty much a legendary player. And the last deck he played in a tournament was a rogue midrange deck, which he ended up winning with. And this kind of reminds me of it. It's a slightly different deck, though. Still playing things like Spiteful Smith, Gadgetzan and Auctioneer, Sylvanas Windrunner, Senjins, Argent Commanders. These are very good midrange minions. Where this variant is the Pirates. There are pirates in this deck. Now, Bloodsail Raiders are a very, very good card in Rogue because you always have that dagger. You always have that dagger. It's always getting better, much better than this just standard sort of... Against other things at the same mana cost, if you have a weapon, he's so much better. And you're playing Rogue. You always have a weapon, let's be honest here. Now, the other things to note is 1 Shiv just helps picking off things. It's kind of like Mortal Coil in that regard. Fan of Knives and Assassinate. Now, in a mid-range metagame, you need 2 Assassinates. However, everything's aggro-based. You don't need 2 Assassinates. You need 2 Fan of Knives to really deal with those aggro starts. Fan of Knives also helps a lot with Blood Imp, which you can afford to use Fan of Knives instead of Betrayal. One note, however, Fan of Knives, while cantrips, being drawing a card, over Betrayal, it can't, however, really deal with the whole double Blood Imp thing. The double Blood Imp is still an issue for this deck to deal with, but if your opponent gets double Blood Imp, then that's just unlucky. Now, onto the state of the metagame. I'm going to be briefly touching on Argent Commander, and then I'm going to be actually talking about Blood Mage Thanos and Shattered Sun Cleric / Defender of Argus. They were on the same segment. I talked about Argent Commander last week. The main reason he's still here is the numbers. That's 16 copies, ladies and gentlemen. 16 out of 16. That's insane. Like 16 copies, and I know Forsen didn't give in his deck list, so I'm taking the numbers from Porn's second deck list. But that's a lot of Argent Commanders, and it really does show sort of the metagame at the moment is just perfect for Argent Commander. Argent Commander deals with all the aggro stoppers like Abomination, Azure Drake, Gadgetzan Auctioneer, really put them out of the metagame. And he's good in mid-range, he's good at control, he's good in aggro, he's just an amazing card at the moment. Probably going to get changed, but for now he's going to dominate the metagame. Now, onto Blood Mage Thanos. Now, this is a legendary that made 5 decks out of 8. That's rather impressive, being in 5 of those decks. Now, why is this card so good? It's a loot hoarder that gives you spell damage. Just think about that. Spell damage is something which a lot of people underestimate, but if you think about it, that spell damage essentially negates Blood Imps. I mean, think about it. You use your removal spell, and then it does an extra damage and negates the Blood Imp buff. It also negates all these buff-centric decks with these Defender Variuses and Shadowed Sun Clerics, helps you power through with your removal, get rid of these threats. Spell damage is a lot more effective than people realize nowadays. It dominated the previous metagame pre the last patch, and it's still good now. Just the metagame is quite fast at the moment, so the only one that really makes it in is Bloodmage Thanos. The Death Rattle, not something to be sniffed at. It's a loot hoarder with spell damage. Treat it as such. That's a very powerful combination of effects, especially for just 2 mana. Now, onto Shattered Sun Cleric and Defender. The reason that these are both here on the same slide is they do effectively the same thing. So one of them is 1 increased mana, and then you get 1 extra buff, and you get Taunt. That's about the only difference between the two of them. That's why they're played so much. Now, Defender fits in slightly less decks. It doesn't fit in these mid-range decks as much. You need some minions on the board for it to really do well, whereas Shattered Sun Cleric is on curve. It's a 3 mana 3/3. It feels kind of bad when you don't get to battle cry it, but it's not the end of the world. And also, not to mention, you need 1 minion on the board as opposed to a Defender. You need 2 for the full value. So it fits in more decks. But besides that, they both do pretty much the same thing. They help with trading. They give you 2-for-1s effectively because they just buff everything up. They get things out of AoE range. That is very critical. You put this on a Fairy Dragon against Priest, and the Priest is really, really annoyed because they can't kill that Fairy Dragon with anything. Apart from maybe Shadow Madness. And even then, it's a bit sketchy. It's just, they're both amazing cards. They both buff your own stuff. The other buff card that's been very popular is Dark Iron Dwarf. Now the reason I didn't put this here is because Dark Iron Dwarf is just obviously very good. It buffs up, gets through Taunt. It's been less relevant recently since people have been playing less Taunt. However, the main reason for the less Taunt has been the aggro-centric metagame. The slower decks are still playing Taunt, which is why Dark Iron is still around in all these aggro decks. But the thing I want to emphasize with Defender and Shadowed Sun Cleric is the health boost. The health buff is a lot more powerful than people seem to realize. It helps you get things out of removal range. It just, something I would trade normally, just doesn't trade. Both very powerful cards. I would play them while we still have them in this current state. So, state of the metagame is very aggro-centric right now. There is some mid-range coming back, but basically, most decks, if you're designing a deck, I would start with the current shell, which is Argent Commander, Shattered Sun Cleric, and then Bloodmage Thanos Defender, all as 2-ops. And then Bloodmage Thanos single, obviously. And then start making your deck. That really is where the metagame is right now. All those cards are amazing. Fit in almost every deck, with the exception of Defender and Shattered Sun Cleric to some extent. And I feel like this is going to change drastically when the next patch comes out, but until then the metagame is pretty set in stone at the moment until someone comes up with some sort of metagame changing deck, like what happened with Rogues and Spell Power in the last patch. So, if you like the content, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions or feedback, say it in the comment section below. If you want to come chat to me, come on Teamspeak. I'll have the address in the description below. But as for now, this has been Jotto, signing off.